Mr. Kim, doing a comms check. Can you hear us? Thank you.
The Military Personnel Subcommittee will come to order. I want to welcome everyone to this hybrid hearing on the findings and recommendations of the Independent Review Commission on Sexual Assault in the Military. We will have two panels today. First, we will receive testimony from the Honorable Dr. Kathleen Hicks, Deputy Secretary of Defense, who will discuss the formation of the Independent Review Commission and how the Department of Defense intends to implement these recommendations. Second, we will hear from a panel including Chair Lynn Rosenthal and members of the Independent Review Commission so they can share their recommendations. The toll of sexual assault and sexual harassment has taken on our military is devastating and incalculable. We do know the numbers, but behind the numbers are lives destroyed and scarred. Since 2010, the Department of Defense estimates that roughly 135,000 active duty service members, 65,400 women, and 69,600 men have been sexually assaulted, and about 509,000 active duty service members, 223,000 women, and 286,000 men have experienced sexual harassment. 1 in 4 service women and 1 in 16 service men experience sexual harassment. 1 in 16 service women and 1 in 143 service men experience sexual assault. Service members who do not identify as heterosexual, who encompass 12% of the active component force, accounted for 43% of all sexually assaulted service members in 2018. But these women and men are not just data points on a PowerPoint slide. They tell harrowing stories of sexual violence, of careless commanders, of indifferent commanders, of a system and culture that fails to protect them. Their voices are all too familiar. One said, "I could have been a great Army nurse if I had a chance. Maybe I shouldn't have reported it." Another shared, "I told him who had done it, and he says, 'He's a good sailor. Do you really want to ruin his career?' I looked at my commander and I was like, 'I guess not. I guess I don't matter.'" Yet another confided, "I was told not to have a Marine who confided in me file a complaint by my commanding officer. He felt the girl was promiscuous and drunk." And there are more than 135,000 voices like those since DoD started keeping track. There are countless more voices we will never hear from. But for over 10 years, I've heard your deafening silence, and the tides are finally turning. Others are hearing you too. Secretary Austin is committed to implementing many of the Independent Review Commission's recommendations, and he and Chairman Milley are committed to removing from the chain of command prosecution decisions for sexual assault, sexual harassment, and other special victims' crimes. That is simply the beginning, the first step on a road with twists and turns. We must ensure not only that the prosecutors who are entrusted to bring justice are properly trained and focused, but also that the military criminal investigators have the right expertise and experience when it comes to investigating sexual assault. We must keep working to ensure survivors can petition a military judge for a protective order that keeps them safe on post and, more importantly, off post too, and that sexual harassment complaints are investigated outside the chain of command by trained and experienced investigators. My pledge to all the survivors of military sexual violence, to those who reported and were ostracized, to those who reported and felt let down by the military justice system, and to all those who were afraid to report and may be suffering alone. We will keep fighting for you. We will keep fighting to change the culture, to increase and accept diversity, to professionalize military justice. I want to thank the IRC members for their extraordinary contribution to our shared goals of protecting our service members from sexual harassment and sexual assault, and to hold accountable those who violate their brothers and sisters in arms. I greatly appreciate IRC's outreach early in the process and its partnership with Congress to achieve meaningful, lasting change. I understand that the Commission's scope was limited to sexual assault and related offenses such as sexual harassment and domestic violence. I believe the Commission's rationale for removing sexual assault prosecution decisions from the chain of command also applies to other felony-level offenses that are non-military specific. Crimes like murder, arson, and robbery are complex to investigate and prosecute, and commanders who are not attorneys do not have the expertise or experience to make high-quality prosecution decisions. And victims and their loved ones may perceive a conflict of interest that discourages reporting. Additionally, I worry about the consistency and effectiveness of a system that treats differently the victims of the worst crimes imaginable. For example, under the Department's proposal, Specialist Vanessa Guillen would have been split in the prosecution of that case between a special victims prosecutor who would have made a charging decision on the sexual harassment allegation, while a commander would have made a charging decision in the murder case. This doesn't make sense to me, and I think we should improve the Department's legislative proposal at markup. I also think it's important to remember that a 2020 GAO study found that service members who are Black or Latino are 2.5 times to 1.5 times more likely to be charged in a court-martial than their white brothers and sisters for the same crime. I appreciate the importance of making sure that diversity is one that we embrace in its entirety. I appreciate your assurances that my efforts to remove all felony crimes from the chain of command are complementary to the IRC's recommendations, and we will continue to fight for this key reform to deliver accountability and justice for all victims of these horrible crimes. Thank you again for your efforts in making our military safe for everyone who serves there. I now will turn it over to Ranking Member Gallagher for his opening remarks.
Thank you, Chairwoman Spear. I look forward to hearing from our panels today about how the Department of Defense will approach sexual assault and sexual harassment in the future. I think we all agree that these are crimes that have absolutely no place in the United States military. As a Marine Corps officer, I quickly learned that sexual assault and related crimes can erode good order and discipline and unit cohesion if not dealt with swiftly and decisively. Our service members deserve an environment where they feel safe, a culture where they know sexual harassment will not be tolerated, and a military justice system that is accountable and responsive. I know we're going to focus a lot of the discussion today on the accountability line of effort. The IRC is recommending a tailored approach to changing the UCMJ, and I'm sure that will receive plenty of attention today and healthy debate. But changing behavior and prevention is the key ingredient to addressing adverse behavior before it becomes unlawful behavior. I understand that the prevention line of effort is interested in identifying and amplifying the most effective prevention measures. I'm interested in how DoD and the IRC view our current prevention efforts and what tools work most effectively. The climate and culture line of effort does give me some pause. More data on the command climate is helpful, but I want to fully understand how the IRC recommendations fit with our existing command tools. The IRC recommended additional qualitative and narrative tools for officer performance evaluation. That recommendation focuses on the need to have officers who elevate, quote, transformational leaders. I would hope that this desire for transformational leadership goes beyond the social acumen cited in the report and also reflects credibly on a variety of effective leadership styles. Empathy is important, but so is competence and lethality. Dr. Hicks, I'm very interested in the implementation timeline you're proposing and the resources that might be needed for some of these reforms to happen. And on panel 2, I'm looking to get more detail on the process and data used to develop the IRC's findings and recommendations. I also look forward to discussing some of the specific recommendations in each line of effort. With that, I thank you and I yield back.
Thank you, Mr. Gallagher. I see the presence of our ranking member with us. Mr. Rogers, would you like to make some opening remarks?
Yeah, thank you, Madam Chair. And Dr. Hicks, it's good to have you with us, and congratulations on your post. I know you're going to do a great job. You're a very capable individual. Having said that, I look forward to hearing from the department and the Independent Review Commission about this new set of recommendations to better address sexual assault in the military. The issue is important and complex. Early on, service members are taught the importance of mutual respect for their fellow soldiers, airmen, sailors, guardians, and Marines. Strong leaders setting clear expectations is essential at preventing destructive behavior and sexual assault. But when sexual assault does happen, the response must be timely and thorough, and it must be backed by professional investigations. These are complex cases. The investigation and court-martial process can be long, complicated, and extremely difficult for victims. The Fort Hood Commission looked at 3 years of court-martials, including 65 trials involving sexual assault charges. Those cases, unfortunately, had a conviction rate of only 22%. Both victims and the accused deserve better. I agree that the time has come to move the prosecution of rape and sexual assault and related crimes to dedicated, uniformed special prosecutors outside the chain of command. Military criminal investigations also need to improve, especially at CID, Army CID. I think these changes will drive stronger cases. Prosecution rates may decline as seasoned prosecutors take hard looks at cases, but in the end, this should bring higher overall conviction rates and increase trust in the military justice process and leadership. That said, I still believe the commanders need full visibility into the process. I strongly believe that commanders must retain full authority over all other offenses. I look forward to hearing from our witness today and the questions, and thank you, and I yield back.
I thank the ranking member. Now, each witness will provide a brief statement. Each member will have the opportunity to question the witnesses for 5 minutes. We respectfully ask the witnesses to summarize their testimony in 5 minutes. Your written comments and statements will be made part of the hearing record. I ask unanimous consent that non-subcommittee members be allowed to participate and ask questions after all subcommittee members have had the opportunity to ask questions. Without objection, so ordered. Now let me welcome our first panel, Dr. Kathleen Hicks, the Deputy Secretary of Defense for the Department of Defense. Thank you for being here today.
Thank you so much, and good afternoon, Chairwoman Spear, Ranking Member Gallagher, and all committee members. A special thank you to Chairwoman Spear for her leadership on this issue over the past decade. I'm here to describe the Department of Defense's efforts to counter the scourge of sexual assault and sexual harassment in our military. Sexual assault and sexual harassment remain serious problems in our force with lethal consequences for our service members and harmful effects on our combat readiness. This administration has placed a high, even unprecedented priority on this challenge set, and we have moved quickly and deliberatively to address it. One day after being sworn in, Secretary Austin issued a memorandum to senior DoD leadership tasking them with reporting on data pertaining to sexual assault and sexual harassment. With information in hand, on February 26th, Secretary Austin detailed 3 immediate actions. He directed the secretaries of the military departments to ensure full compliance with existing sexual assault and sexual harassment policies. He directed a series of on-site installation evaluations requiring quarterly reports on installations and units of greatest concern, as well as those that show promise. And he required the secretaries of the military departments to identify and resource dedicated personnel for prevention of interpersonal violence and self-harm. On that same day, Secretary Biden directed Secretary Austin to establish the 90-day Independent Review Commission, which I'm going to refer to going forward as the IRC. On June 21st, the IRC provided its findings and recommendations to Secretary Austin. Its report was comprehensive, evidence-based, stakeholder-informed, and solution-oriented. Its 82 recommendations spanned 4 lines of effort: accountability, prevention, climate and culture, and victim care and support. On July 2nd, 2021, less than 6 months after stating his intent to lead DoD in countering sexual assault and sexual harassment, Secretary Austin directed an implementation way ahead. Regarding accountability, the Secretary is seeking legislative help where needed and directing departmental action directly where it's within its purview. He is seeking reforms to the Uniform Code of Military Justice. Of note, we request removing sexual assault and related crimes from the military chain of command and adding sexual harassment as an offense. Given the uniqueness of each service, we seek to establish special prosecutors within each military department, reporting directly to each military department secretary. The Secretary of Defense would set standards that govern the prosecutor framework. And in our legislative proposal, we seek a fail-safe provision that would allow the Secretary of Defense to centralize oversight in OSD where the military departments failed to meet any requisite milestones. Secretary Austin also directed several accountability reforms that do not require legislation. These include standardizing non-judicial punishment across all services, establishing a process to initiate separation for service members against whom there are substantiated sexual harassment claims, and professionalizing career tracks for lawyers and investigators in these areas. I am taking a phased approach to developing comprehensive implementation plans across all of these recommendations. Although we are on a fast timeline, our approach is methodical and deliberate. The Department of Defense is the largest enterprise in the United States with approximately 2.9 million service members and civilians spread out across 4,800 sites in over 160 countries. This issue set will require substantial leadership at all levels to ensure changes that challenge us in culture, resources, and time to ensure are effective and enduring. We have no intention of rushing to failure and risking the loss of faith from those who have trusted us and to lose the trust of another generation of service members. Once we have our roadmap in place, our efforts will be consistently monitored by me and the department's senior-most leadership via the Deputies Workforce Council. The Secretary and I are committed to ensuring sustained attention to drive these changes as effectively and expeditiously as possible. The President, the Secretary, and I have prioritized countering sexual assault and sexual harassment, acting quickly and decisively, and we have a plan of action for effective implementation of needed reforms. And we will see to it that every corner of the department implements these changes in letter and in spirit. Our service members deserve no less, and our combat effectiveness depends on our success. Thank you.
Thank you, Dr. Hicks. I recognize myself for 5 minutes, and in so doing, would also like to recognize the presence of Vanessa Guillen's sister, Myra Guillen, and attorney Natalie Coam. They have been articulate, powerful, passionate in their efforts to try and make sure that Vanessa's death and murder was not in vain. So I appreciate you being here today. Dr. Hicks, The IRC recommended that sexual harassment be investigated by trained investigators outside the chain of command. I didn't see that recommendation included in the department's legislative proposal. Does the DoD plan to implement an independent sexual harassment investigations, and how do they intend to do that if the answer is yes?
Yes, Chairwoman Spear, we do, and we believe that's within our purview. It's not under the list of legislative items that I've mentioned. We do, however, have a full set of the 82 recommendations from the IRC. I have from the Secretary until the end of the summer to go through all of those with the team inside across the department, looking at the staffing, resourcing, organizational changes, synchronizing we would need to do. But as the Secretary made clear, he's moving forward with a general disposition toward accepting the recommendations of the IRC. We're scrubbing all those now, but I can assure you that is one where we absolutely plan to move forward.
All right. In Secretary Austin's February memo, he outlined a number of steps, including establishing a violence prevention workforce and reviewing the command climate at high-risk installations. What work has been completed so far in these steps, and what has the department found from its high-risk installation reviews so far? And how will these existing efforts mesh with the department's implementation of IRS recommendations?
Thank you very much. To your last point, what we found is that the IRC recommendations and the immediate actions we were already moving on mesh very, very well. So part of what we're doing in implementation right now is making sure we understand any slight differences that might exist in how we proceed. On your question on the violence prevention workforce, we've put in some additional funding requests in FY22 that are in our proposed budget that were in advance of the IRC recommendations. So those relate, generally speaking, to building out our Undersecretariat for Personnel and Readiness's capability in this area, as well as providing some additional resources inside the services in the military departments, that is, in order to ensure that they can build out that capability. That said, we saw that as a first step as the IRC recommendations were pending. Going into the fall, we hope to be able to provide Congress in the early fall a sense of how much more we believe needs to be done, both with regard to the FY22 budget, but then moving forward. The on-site installation process, the review, climate review process there, is ongoing now. We have selected those installations that we believe require a deeper dive, either because they are potential models or because we have seen some early findings that make us think that we need to do deeper dives. So we have teams already set to go out. With apologies, they may actually already have gone out, but that would have begun in the last several weeks if they have begun that. But we're already moving out on that on-site installation process now.
Would you make the committee aware of what installations are in that particular group? Because I'm looking at the RAND study on organizational characteristics associated with risks of sexual assault and sexual harassment in the Army, and they point out the 5 highest total risk installations: Fort Hood, Fort Bliss, Korea, Fort Carson, and some small foreign bases. And I'm just curious to what extent you have reviewed this in making the assessment as to which bases to move to first.
We'd be happy to provide the list of installations. I would just say what we are doing is on top of what the military departments are already doing. And the Department of Army had already accepted all the recommendations of the Fort Hood Independent Review Commission, which itself included an on-site installation review process. So I do believe the Department of Army has already moved out on that. So we'll give you both lists, both ours on top of that and what the military departments are doing.
And then finally, the climate surveys. Certainly the Fort Hood Review Committee came up with some startling results as to how climate surveys, as extensive as they are, as expensive as they are not properly reviewed and not considered as part of the performance evaluation for officers and NCOs. To what extent has the department committed to implementing those changes, and how soon will we see results?
So we have already begun the revamping of those climate survey approaches. The Fort Hood report actually was very insightful in terms of their findings of the way in which the department in that case, the Army, but the department in general has been doing those climate surveys. So we've been working to update the climate review process that we use. Those on-site inspections I referenced, that the first wave of those that's going out will use a new approach, a new set of questions, if you will, and evaluative criteria. So we have that process ongoing now. Again, our expectation in this phased approach is now that we have the IRC's full recommendations, we see and it's very much validated in their findings the importance of climate and culture to this solution set and a wide set of recommendations from them. We will be trying to prioritize the order in which we'll pursue these items and the resources required.
Thank you. Mr. Gallagher, you're recognized for 6 minutes.
Thank you. Dr. Hicks, what current crime prevention tools do you believe are most effective? Do you believe that there are IRC recommendations that would enhance those tools?
The second line of effort from the IRC was this prevention line of effort, and they'll be in front of you soon here, and let them speak for themselves. But what struck me in their report is the degree to which they believe the department has underinvested in prevention over the years, both at the individual and the unit level, what they would call the community level. And what I think really stands out to me is just thinking of whether you're thinking about suicide or you're thinking about self-harm or harm to others and sexual violence. It really is this public health approach of trying to understand how to help individuals who may be, subject to being victims or who may be subject to being perpetrators. The underinvestment we've had in understanding perpetrators, which was a key finding, I think, from the IRC. And then that unit or community approach of understanding, as part of holistic readiness, how are you pulling together your unit and making sure that you can, it can cohere, that you understand your soldier, sailor, airman, Marine, Guardian, what they're doing in their, time and how they're working together with others. I think that was a huge piece of that prevention effort.
I think related to that, or at least part of the set of recommendations to improve leadership within certain commands is this idea that the IRC talks about for more narrative feedback for officer and leader evaluations. How can that type of feedback be used to evaluate different leadership tools? How will you ensure a balance between leadership in the deployed unit and the IRC's emphasis on empathy, in other words?
Yeah, if you think about the way in which we do feedback right now, whatever service you're in, your review, let's say it's your OER, each service uses a slightly different lingo. Those are qualitative narratives, and I think really what the IRC is pointing to and where we are seeing we need to put more emphasis is really the types of inputs that shape those narratives. We want to give tools to commanders at all levels so that they are best equipped to meet when they're having those narratives written up. They have the capabilities and the qualities, the traits that are being sought, and then they're being held accountable against those traits. So I think the key traits to my mind, I'm not sure I would use the term empathy exactly. I think it's really leadership skills. How do you ensure that your unit is as ready as possible in a holistic sense? Is their equipment ready? Are they cohering as a unit? Is each member individually ready in all senses? And are they able to respect one another in a way that when they're downrange, they're out there to protect each other and they have that sort of warrior culture of how they cohere as a unit? I think that's the kind of ethos that we're trying to build into how they think about leadership.
And as I think about this problem or set of problems, for me, at least personally, probably the thorniest part or the hardest part to solve is just the issue of initial reporting. And I'm struck by some of the statistics in our overall committee hearing about, I think in 2018, 20,000 cases in a survey, but only 8,000 of those were reported. I mean, that's a stunning discrepancy, and we could all have our own theory for why that is, a fear of retaliation, complexities within the particular command itself. I'd just be curious as you think about how to get at that issue, create an environment in which victims feel like they can report a crime safely. Are there any solutions that jump out to you?
Absolutely, and I think this is where Vanessa Guillen's case is so striking that she was harassed and went to her mother and didn't feel she could tell without without consequences. Clearly, someone else. We never ever want that. That should never happen to another person in service. So several of the things I think we're doing and thinking ahead to the implementation plan, the IRC team uses this phrase "no wrong door," which I think is so important, which is the idea that no matter what base you're at, what facility, whatever door you walk in, whether it's the Family Services Center, whether it's you're actually seeing a sexual harassment, sexual assault and sexual harassment specialist, victim advocate, whether you're walking into the clinic, someone is there to listen to you and to talk to you, and if you will, intake that from a public health perspective, is ready to talk to you. The second is the basic trust issue, which has been so at the center of the conversation around accountability, but back to command climate, this idea that that there is a quality prevention workforce, that you have a command climate that is supportive of you, and that you have these resources in victim care. Those are sort of those other three lines of effort that we're really trying to emphasize. And I think, there were some smaller things we're trying out already now in terms of being able to move, having the ability to choose a different unit, even potentially a different installation. There are efforts like that already underway that we're able to assess the degree to which they're successful and perhaps grow that use across the force.
Thank you. I yield my 5 seconds back.
I thank the ranking member. Our next speaker will be Mr. Kim for 5 minutes. You are recognized.
Thank you, Chairwoman, and thank you, Secretary, for joining and having the opportunity to speak with us. The IRC recommends removing the commander from the prosecution of what they deem as special victims crimes and referring special alleged crimes to a special victims prosecutor or some kind of individual outside the chain of command who has a depth of expertise in sensitive crimes. My understanding is that this would include sexual assault, but also include crimes based in relationship or the vulnerability of the victim, such as a domestic abuse, child abuse, hate crimes, or hazing. So I wanted to ask you for additional information in terms of what was the IRC's rationale in terms of defining these particular categories.
I would really prefer to Congressman Kim to defer to the IRC to describe its rationale. What I can say is that the Department of Defense's approach has 7 articles related to sexual misconduct or retaliation and sexual harassment in the UCMJ reforms that we recommend.
Well, let's look at those 7 then that you're talking about there. I guess the question that I'm having is, kind of building off of what the chairwoman said in her opening remarks about what is it that we understand about this particular problem set, but also how does this help us understand potential other reforms or changes that we should be considering. So I guess my question to you is, with those 7 categories that you talked about, is there any reason that this approach that you're discussing and presenting would not be useful or successful for other crimes, including felony crimes, as the chairwoman stated? Is that something that you think would also provide a roadmap for how we address those other types of crimes?
We took a problem-centric approach to this issue and began with the problem scope around sexual harassment, sexual assault, and related sexual misconduct. And I think what we did here is a very good model for how we should approach other major challenges, that particularly people challenges, but any challenges in the department. We obviously brought in outside experts. We had a very evidence-based approach. And we engaged stakeholders throughout the department. And at the end of the day, we were able to bring to a leadership decision from the highest levels. The secretary, the chairman, brought the chiefs in, the service secretaries, et cetera. And we are dedicated to pushing change that moves fast and delivers for victims of sexual assault and sexual harassment and for the next generation of service members. So why do I explain all that? I think that's the approach you have to take, beginning with the problem and trying to identify for that problem, any of these complex problems, what moves the needle. And that's what we've promised to do here, is move the needle. I don't currently have evidence, as I do in this case, that there's a specific issue around trust of the commander that weighs in the balance. At the same time, we scoped this particular approach in our legislation, understanding that faith, that good order and discipline, that faith and trust between commander and commanded is absolutely vital to military readiness. So we're trying to make sure we take an approach that reinforces that trust, that addresses a specific problem in an evidence-based way, and that we can implement to deliver real changes in a system that needs this change to deliver for sexual assault and sexual harassment victims. That, to me, is the way we should address any other types of challenges, whether it's about military justice or anything else in the department.
Well, I appreciate that. I do have to say I admire the approach that was taken and the thoughtfulness and the the intensity and focus with which you approach this. So I guess my question there is, we have had members of Congress and others raise concerns about other types of crimes. Is the DoD currently planning, either now or down the road, to have an IRC type review on handling other felony level crimes?
We don't currently have that. We're happy to work with Congress to pursue that. I certainly have no objection to looking at that issue down the line, but that has not been something that's been raised either by Congress or in other GAO. I've looked through all GAO, et cetera. That has not come up yet, but we are happy to pursue that. And I think the key is to frame the problem question right, so we are as responsive as possible to what the question is.
I appreciate it. I yield back, Chairwoman.
The gentleman yields. Deputy Secretary, you are aware, of course, that many other countries have included non-military felonies, and it has not impacted good order and discipline or unit cohesion, including the UK, Canada, Germany, Israel, correct?
I'm aware that other systems use that approach. I am not, cannot say to you today what the outcome-based view is from military justice experts on those outcomes. Without prejudice, I say that.
All right. Now, Ms. McClain, you are recognized for 5 minutes. I don't see you on the screen. Are you with us? Well, we'll come back to you. Mr. Jackson, you are recognized for 5 minutes.
Thank you, Chairwoman Spear and Ranking Member Gallagher for having this hearing today. I also want to thank Dr. Hicks for being here. From my time in the military, I know that it's possible for there to be a gap that exists between senior leaders, what they believe is happening under the commands, and what junior enlisted service members are actually experiencing. While this is not exclusive to any one aspect of the military, that disconnect can be highlighted when we discuss sexual assault and other special victims crimes. We come here each week to discuss modernization efforts and ways to improve readiness, but the most important thing we do is to take care of the service members. So again, I do appreciate the chairwoman holding this hearing today. Thank you, ma'am. As a husband, a father, and a retired flag officer, I firmly believe that even one instance of sexual assault is far too many. While we work together on a bipartisan basis to find solutions, I want to ensure that it is not lost on us that we have commanders in our military who do things the right way and lead courageously to address these issues. I believe that it is important that a commander is engaged in all aspects of his or her unit so that he or she has the entire picture when making decisions. Making informed decisions is a key component of being a leader. By relegating commanders to a lesser role in military justice, I feel it could undermine the foundation of a unit. Commanders would have all the accountability for crimes committed in their unit, but would not have the authority to fully discipline certain conduct. Dr. Hicks, I have concerns that by removing the prosecution of these crimes from the chain of command, that we will inadvertently reduce the overall effectiveness of a commander. Do you share these concerns? And if so, why? And if not, why not?
Congressman Jackson, I think the way I would frame this from our perspective, having looked so hard at exactly this issue, is we have identified in this class, this category of cases, a very specific concern, evidenced concern around trust and command. And we believe that it has the price we are paying for that lack of trust is not acceptable. And we do have concerns about ensuring, as I've said before here, that the quality of readiness, that quality of connection between commander and commanded is retained. So we don't just simply take something out of the chain of command. That's looking past, I think, the whole of what we're trying to do here. What we're trying to do is build trust in the system, build tools for victims, build tools in the prevention force, but build tools for commanders so that they are in a stronger position to stay connected, even as we make this class of cases, if you will, this class of offenses, something that's pulled out, which is a best-in-class practice in the civilian sector, to have this set of sexual misconduct efforts be a separate prosecutorial approach. So we're following best practice, we think, there.
Yes, ma'am. Thank you. I agree that what we're doing now is not working, so I thank you. There are many factors that are involved in looking at any given case. Dr. Hicks, once again, I just ask one more question. What percentage of substantiated cases are not prosecuted due to issues with evidence or reluctance from the victim? And how do the independent review commission's recommendations or changes to the UCMJ address these fundamental issues?
Congressman, I'd have to take that for the record. I don't have that data in front of me, and the IRC may have better data in their panel.
Okay, thank you, ma'am.
Thank you.
I appreciate that. Thank you for your thoughtful response. I take this issue very seriously, but I do want to ensure that we look at all of the implications as we move forward on this year's NDAA. I look forward to working with you and my colleagues here on the committee and the subcommittee to take care of the men and women who are serving our country. And with that, Madam Chair, I yield back. Thank you.
The gentleman yields back. The gentlelady from Texas is recognized for 5 minutes.
Thank you, Madam Chair, and thank you so much, Dr. Hicks, for your testimony and for your work on this issue. I represent El Paso, Texas, which is home to Fort Bliss, one of the installations listed, one of the installations of concern. And one of the things that I'd like to share with my colleagues and with you as I've learned more about this issue, especially with what's transpired at the military installation that I have the incredible privilege of representing, is that sexual assault frequently is not isolated in its impact, and it's frequently not the only thing that is occurring around that woman, because most frequently it's a woman who's assaulted, although obviously men are as well. But what I have found is that there are other facets of this: suicide, drug use, alcohol use, harassment, all sorts of other components, which is why I feel very strongly that in terms of removing felonies from the chain of command and putting them in outside of the chain, that addresses and acknowledges the complexity around the kind of criminal activity that leads to or includes sexual assault. So I wanted to share that with you and with my colleagues, just so that you know the lens through which I am looking at much of this. And it's been shaped by what's happened at Fort Bliss. I'm very curious. I'd like to learn more about the deeper dive that you were talking about with the on-site installation process. What is the general timeline for that? What are you all looking at? What are the parameters for review? When you do have the final results of that deeper dive, when can Congress expect to see it, especially those of us who represent installations that are in the top 5? So would love to hear from you on those details.
Great, thank you very much. I do want to point out that our legislation does include very high overlap areas like domestic violence, which is a huge one, harassment, et cetera. So I just don't want it to be thought that we've scoped it so narrowly that those continuum of harm issues are outside our scope. On the on-site installation process, as I said, it's underway. now. We would be happy to come back even in the fall timeframe to give you a sense of because those teams will be through their initial first drive through that first set by end of summer, roughly. So we would be able to come back in the fall and provide information on that process, what was used for evaluation, and what the findings were. I will say I think you asked me the way we will use it going forward, and the idea here is, of course, that we can target, if we understand what's working well at certain installations, we can learn things where we have the installations where there's a problem, or maybe there's a unit on the installation where there's a problem. We can start to target resources there. When you look across the whole of what we're trying to do here to counter sexual assault and sexual harassment and related crimes, it will be very resource and leadership intensive. So the more we can understand where to target those resources, that will really help us, and exactly how to do it. So that's around the type of prevention resources that are there, what's in the civilian sector, maybe outside off installation, what are those capacities and capabilities that we could liaise with, better leverage, anything on command climate in those areas. Those are the types of things we're looking for.
And speaking to the command climate, obviously there are changes in command that have happened. Will the deeper dive take a look at a predecessor, for example, and what happened under a predecessor, what changes have been made currently, or is it just a deeper dive into what's happening there currently?
It will be able to assess all the dynamics, including things that may have happened in the past that shape the current environment. So that would certainly be something they would take into account.
Okay, and it would, the deeper dive would include a broad look at all of the continuum of harm as you described.
That's exactly right. That's
Okay.
exactly right. Yes.
All right.
Yeah.
Thank you so
Yeah.
much. I look forward to the
Absolutely.
results and the information that comes from that deeper dive, especially as it pertains to Fort Bliss. Madam Chair, I yield back.
Gentlelady yields back. Dr. Hicks, I won't ask you to comment on this, but I would just like you to file this away. When Vanessa Guillen's murder took place at Fort Hood, Inspector General went down within a short period of time, came back and reported that everything was just fine. And it was then Secretary Ryan who stood up this independent review committee, who then went down, and in the course of a very few months, and really not a high expense of money, was able to come back with a really robust and comprehensive review. I am just concerned that the independence that we saw in the Fort Hood review may be lost by having persons within the military doing this special review of these various installations. So we can talk further about that later. We'll now hear from Mr. Fallon, who is recognized for 5 minutes.
Thank you, Madam Chair. Thank you, Dr. Hicks. So, just full disclosure, having been a military member, not an admiral, but I initially was hesitant to remove prosecutorial authority from the chain of command. But as Admiral and Doctor and Congressman Ronnie Jackson was saying, it's not what we're doing now is not working. And so I have a few questions. The Independent Review Commission stood up for about, is it roughly 4 months? Is that accurate?
90 days.
90, okay, so 3 months. And to assess the sexual assault issue in the military. And their findings came back and they wanted to remove sexual assault cases from the chain of command, but also, and correct me if I'm mistaken here, but also domestic violence, the distribution of intimate images, stalking, child abuse, and retaliation. Is that accurate?
Yes, that's accurate.
Right. Do you know why they included those other issues?
We do as well, Congressman. They are related crimes. It's considered a continuum of harm, and there's an ability in the science and in the social science to be able to see how they connect and lead up to actual sexual assault.
Okay. And so after the 90 days, you recommended that, but recommended that all other felonies stay in the chain of command.
We did not make any recommendations other than inside sexual assault and sexual
Right.
harassment.
So you didn't touch the other
We
felonies?
we did not touch
So
that.
that would be status quo, and that would remain in the chain of command?
Correct.
If your recommendations were followed?
Correct.
Okay. So do you know, are you aware that there was no studies done, that were no serious discussions about the impact of moving all felonies? Because there are some folks in Congress that want to remove all felonies from the chain of command.
Yeah, I'm aware of one study that is the result of an NDAA direction, which I have somewhere here, but I'm only aware of one that the department has, or department-related bodies have been asked to undertake. That particular study did not recommend moving forward, but that's the only study I'm aware of.
Because if I recall correctly, Secretary Austin was also wanted a narrow scope as far as removing the felonies from the chain of command.
That's correct.
And so if we were going to vote on something like that, like removing all felonies, how long would that take to properly study the impact that they could have on the military?
I couldn't give you an exact timeline, but I think if the Congress directed further study from the department, you probably want some outside experts to study it as well, but from the department, we would undertake to do that as quickly as Congress asked us to do it, but I would think we would probably need 6 months.
Okay. Yeah, because I seem to recall that some of the offline conversations, it was 6 months, a year, or something like that. So I think any kind of vote on something of that magnitude would be premature until you all could come back with us and with that information to give us the best ability to make the correct decisions moving forward. So thank you very much. And Madam Chair, I yield back.
Gentleman yields back. The gentlewoman from Pennsylvania, Ms. Houlihan, is recognized for 5 minutes.
Thank you, Madam Chair. Just confirming that you can hear me.
Yes, we can. You're very loud, actually.
Okay, then I'll try and lower it a little bit. My first question has to do with a follow-up from Representative Escobar. You talked a little bit about the time frame for implementation after you develop your roadmap, but I have a little bit of a question regarding the fact that, as we all know, there are a lot of positions in the DoD and in the Office of the Secretary of Defense that are political appointee positions. So are you planning on having also a recommendation or a process for continuity of implementation for the DoD beyond potentially this current administration, were that to be a reality?
Yes, Congresswoman, in particular with the prevention workforce, which is where I think we will end up finding, we're still doing the analysis now, but where we will end up finding there and in the victim care, the most need for dedicated personnel. I would anticipate that change from today to that future will look like career civilian, a lot more career civilian framing than either a transitory political appointee or even necessarily more use of military personnel. So that's where I think you'd find the enduring connection with the recommendations.
Thanks, and I would encourage that we think about that. My experience having been a member of the service myself and also growing up in the military, that there is quite a lot of rotation and churn and burn, not just within the administration appointed positions, but in other positions as well. So making sure that we think about that is important. For you as well, my other question has to do with the most recent question which preceded me, which had to do with a timeline. Were we to look into bringing everything under the umbrella of this piece of legislation or this vote? And you mentioned that something 6 months to a year might be the timeline. Can you comment on why, if it could be in fact done in 6 months to a year, the fact that this particular sexual assault and other ancillary and related crimes took the better part of a decade to be able to understand the data around? And why should this be any different?
No, thank you so much for that. I think the major difference, I have to say, is leadership and direction. As I tried to make clear, it really did take leadership from Congress in a bipartisan way, quite frankly, alongside, of course, the President, direction from the President of the United States and the Secretary of Defense. That's a tremendous amount of positive momentum to the system. And I think you would want to see something like that in order to move as quickly and as decisively. We won't be done when legislation is done in this case. We have a lot of work to do to make sure that leadership at every level of the department is actually moving forward and putting in the time and resources, investing in the future of this prevention and climate and culture and accountability and victim care framework. We would expect the same thing would have to happen, I think, if we wanted to move on a fast timeline elsewhere. We would need that same leadership. I'll say one thing I said before, but I feel it bears repeating. The problem has to be well-defined as well. And here in sexual assault and sexual harassment, the problem is very well-defined. We've spent many years, as you pointed out, with many studies on it. And we have a lot of data. So that helps jumpstart everything. And the better and more clearly we can define the problem we're solving, I think that will help propel, give us some added momentum to move quickly.
And this, my final question relates to that. And if you could share, aside from the fact that you feel as though you might need better problem set definition or more time, can you share any other, with the panel, any other opposition that the DoD has to the Vanessa Guillen Military Justice Improvement and Increasing Prevention Act that we could appreciate and understand?
Congresswoman, I can't speak specifically to that piece of legislation. If the question is around the scope of the set of offenses that would move outside the chain of command, which is at once a very large issue and at the same time not really related to the sexual assault, sexual harassment scope that we're trying to push. I think the biggest challenge we face is making sure we can effectuate positive change on sexual assault and sexual harassment in a timely manner that builds faith back into the system. We have, when we've made this scoping recommendation, we are thinking ahead to how we effectively execute on this in order to show results and to build trust. So we do have a concern that at once we are trying to accomplish this important goal on sexual assault and sexual harassment, we would be swamping it and diffusing our efforts with other goals.
The gentlewoman's
Thank you. I'm
time
afraid
has
I've run out of time and I yield back.
The gentlewoman from Oklahoma, Ms. Bice, is recognized for 5 minutes.
Well, first, thank you, Madam Chair, for holding this very important hearing, and Deputy Secretary Hicks, thank you for being here today. One of the findings in the IRC's report was that many female service members report being treated differently than their male counterparts, and that some female service members described being the subject of regular sexist comments. The report noted that less than 18% of the total workforce is female. The question I have for you is, are we doing enough to address the retention and recruitment of women into the service? And if not, how are we going to address that moving forward?
Congresswoman, we are not doing enough to address retention, recruitment and retention of women in the workforce. We know that women are increasing percent of the nation's overall workforce. We know that as we look ahead to the next 5, 10, 15 years, in order to get the high quality force, both civilian and military, we rely upon, we have to be able to tap really all segments of American society effectively to do that. We have underway a diversity, equity, and inclusion set of efforts that are run through bringing in all the service uniformed military and civilian leadership, the Deputies Workforce Council that I chair alongside the Joint Staff counterpart, the Vice Chairman. And that is one of the areas we're looking very closely at. We're looking at everything from how folks, what our incentive structures are, how we move people through the system, if you will, in terms of promotions, how we think about the different pathways to promotion, but also the unit types that are most likely to be promoted making sure we can get more women and other representatives of a diverse nation into those portions of the workforce. So that's work that is ongoing. It builds on work that was done in the last administration on the same basic pathway. So we try to emphasize all the time that it is a nonpartisan approach. It is simply smart business to make sure you can get that workforce you need for the future.
Follow-up, how do you ensure, though, that women that are joining our military feel valued and respected and included, given the circumstances that surround sexual harassment and sexual assault? I think it's a detriment to many women for consideration of the military because they do not feel that this issue has been addressed effectively.
Yes, so I think this gets back to what is the kind of ethos, what's that warrior ethos that we're instilling in the military, and we need to, a lot of the work around command climate that we're focused on with regard to sexual violence bears out in terms of how you look holistically at the force, including women in service. And that is to say that, leadership and command is about creating cohesion in your unit. It is about valuing and respecting the membership of those units. It is not about denigrating any particular type of person, such as women in your unit. That's something the Commandant of the Marine Corps has spoken very, I think, eloquently on this idea of subcultures of denigration. And that's the type of, we need to counter that with command climate focused approaches that make clear that to succeed in our military, you have to actually build up your force, not tear it down.
Thank you. Thank you. Thank you for your testimony today, Madam Chair. I yield back.
Gentlewoman yields back. The gentleman from Texas, Mr. Vesey, is recognized for 5 minutes.
Thank you, Madam Chair. I want to really, I think it's very important that we're doing these panels and talking about this today. Obviously, this is a topic that I think that most of the country is really thinks is important, that we finally get to the bottom of addressing this. It was amazing when we took our Codell to Fort Hood and listened to so many female soldiers and other soldiers talk about just how important it was for their voices to finally, start to be heard on these issues, and how it was really critical for them to finally start to see change. And that's one of the reasons why I'm very supportive of the Vanessa Guillen Military Justice Improvement and Increasing Prevention Act. I know that there have been some concerns that some people have talked and expressed to you about separating the cases. And so I wanted to specifically ask you about that. What are your thoughts on how to make sure that we don't stigmatize sexual assault further by pulling it into a separate category based on the IRC recommendations?
Thank you, Congressman. And I've also been down to Fort Hood, and your comments really resonate with me. The approach that we are taking is similar to the best-in-class approach taken in the civilian sector, where there are special prosecutors who are, they specialize in sexual misconduct, sexual assault, sexual harassment, sexual misconduct, because that is the way to deliver the best quality outcome. That's the model that we followed. So it's just that, that is a different way of looking at the problem than a holistic rewrite of the approach to military justice for felonies. I think that approach helps us best on countering sexual assault and sexual harassment and related crimes quickly and effectively, and we will deliver real outcomes that grow trust in that military justice system overall, at the same time that we're working on these other elements, these other lines of effort that are relevant to that problem.
So in addition to tackling the issue of sexual assault in the military, I know that another area that we heard from service members too was around issues around race and discrimination. Black and Hispanic service members are far more likely than white members to be tried in general and special court-martials in all military services, even when controlling for attributes such as rank and education. This is across every military service. I wanted to ask you, taking in the recommendations from this report, Can DOD utilize these recommendations to help in these areas? And could this help with the potential disparity within race in the military? Could this help with the potential disparity within race in the military justice system? And are there other areas where we can use these recommendations?
My answer is I don't know. I think the problem set is an important one that you're citing the GAO study that speaks very well, first of all, one of their first findings is the data isn't good. So the department has a challenge to get better data that links race and outcomes in the military justice system. But even getting beyond the data question and taking the GAO data where we have it, what GAO points to is there's no assessment yet on why that's the outcome. What they point to is that there may be points in the process that are leading to this, but they don't come to any findings on what those are. So the answer is I think we would have to do that work. We should do that work. We owe it to those members in uniform, especially if there's in fact proven out through the data racial disparity in the military justice system. I think we need to take that problem-centric approach, get the experts involved, look at the data. It doesn't need to take 10 years. We need to get after that problem with leadership at the top. But whether it gets you to the same kind of solutions, I have no way to know that. I don't think it's an issue we just tack on to sexual assault and sexual harassment. I think it's an issue that deserves to be understood in its fullness, and I just don't have those answers today.
Okay. Yeah, no, I appreciate your candor on that. Madam Chair, I yield back.
The gentleman yields back. The gentlewoman from California, Ms. Jacobs, is recognized for 5 minutes.
Well, thank you, Madam Chair, and good to see you, Deputy Secretary, and most importantly, nice to be able to call you Deputy Secretary. I want to thank you and Secretary Austin for all of the work you're doing on this issue. I represent a huge military community. I talk to families all the time who are concerned about their family members. And yet I also have some concern that outside of your office and the Secretary and the Joint Chiefs of Staff, we've heard from military leadership who kind of make clear that they don't support this kind of systemic reform. And so even if we implement all of the recommendations in some capacity, what concrete steps will you take to ensure compliance and widespread support of the changes within the leadership and then through the chain of command?
First of all, it's nice to see you too, Congresswoman, and nice to call you that. I have concerns. I have significant concerns about our ability to drive this kind of change. The administration, has potentially, short periods of time here to make these changes happen. It's going to take a lot of effort. But what I think you can count on is the President and the Secretary and I are here, and we're here to put in that effort. And we'll work closely with those throughout the department. We have had good conversations already at the senior-most levels, including the uniform levels of the department. There's certainly an understanding. This is the direction we're going in. The Secretary's been very clear in his direction to the department. A couple of specific things I would point to. We put in what I called this fail-safe approach, which is that even though the military departments in our legislative proposal would be directed to have these special prosecutors working directly to the service secretaries. We also have this fail-safe to pull that back to OSD, which was the IRC's original recommendation, should that be deemed necessary by the secretary. So that's a very clear sort of Damocles, if you will, hanging over those military departments to ensure they would far prefer to have it moving at the military department level. So we think that's a good incentive for them to get it right. And I think the big concern we've seen in the department since we've come to the Secretary's direction in early July is concern around resources and implementation timelines. And that's where I have my homework to do by the end of summer for the Secretary to really lay out what that looks like and then to come back to Congress in the early fall with any requests that we have around resources.
Well, thank you, and please do let us know what we can do to help make sure all of these things get implemented. I wanted to follow up on something my colleagues talked about earlier around underreporting of sexual assault. Despite all of the efforts that have been made to foster a culture of trust, which you note is key to enabling victims to come forward, a RAND study showed that 1 in 4 active duty women reported experience of sexual harassment, but the department only received 1,781 reports. So while sweeping reforms are necessary, I wanted to know what work you will do to make sure that as those reforms are taking place, they're communicated clearly in order to foster greater confidence in any new reporting systems.
I'll share an anecdote that the IRC has in its own report. I hope I'm not stealing their thunder, but they give an example of where prevention, one example they saw was considered to be a good expenditure of resources on prevention was water bottles with a phone number on it. Or you can pick your favorite example like that. It takes a lot more than that, to your point, to actually create that trust in the system, to ensure folks know where they're supposed to go. It's a lot of training. And it is that, I just say one thing, it's that high quality prevention workforce. If there's one thing I think that I really took away from my visits to Fort Hood, my meetings with the Guillen family and other like endeavors of reading the Fort Hood report, it is the importance of that prevention, having that professional, specialized prevention workforce. So I think that's a lot of what we can do to ensure folks actually feel comfortable reporting. They know where to report. And if they're a little wrong about where to report, they're still going to get the outcome. They're still going to get a response.
Thank you. And my time is running short, so I'll send the actual question for the record, but just wanted to note that, it's been over a decade since Don't Ask, Don't Tell was repealed, and yet I hear all the time from LGBTQ plus members of the military who continue to face unparalleled levels of harassment. And so just want to make sure that that issue doesn't get lost as we focus so rightly on the women in the force as well. Madam Chair, I yield back.
The gentlewoman's time has expired and she yields. To underscore that point, a recent RAND study, as I'm sure you're aware, Dr. Hicks, indicates that 40% of the victims of sexual assault are LGBTQ members. So it's an area we need to spend a lot of time on. We'll now have the gentleman from Maryland. Is Ms. Strickland, has she returned?
I'm here.
We can't see you. There you are. We can see you now. All right. The gentleman from Washington is recognized for 5 minutes.
Thank you, Madam Chair. Deputy Secretary Hicks, an issue that has been identified in a series of reports, including the IRC report, is the problems with data collection across the services when it comes to identifying racial disparities in the administration of military justice. The IRC reportedly said it clearly. Racial disparities in the military justice system are inherently tied to sexual harassment and sexual assault. Given that this problem is across all the services, can you describe how the department is working to standardize data collection so that we get a complete picture on the scope of the problem?
Congresswoman, I would owe you a fuller response for the record. What I would say is that to your very point, the department was made clear in the GAO reporting that data collection is a major challenge and that we owe greater accountability around that. It is my understanding that beginning late last year, we have begun stronger data collection, but I want to give you a fuller response to that.
All right, thank you. And then one other question I have as well. Underrepresented groups are especially vulnerable to sexual assault and harassment, potentially because of harmful effects of attitudes on gender, race, ethnicity, sexual orientation, and gender identity. Lesbian, gay, and bisexual service members are much more likely to be sexually assaulted than their heterosexual peers, and racial and ethnic minority women may experience both racial harassment and gender-based violence simultaneously, perhaps making both more difficult to detect or report. This indicates that we have a lot of work to do to ensure that we have a force that is inclusive and a command climate that maintains good order and good discipline. Could you please talk more about why having an inclusive force is important for maintaining readiness and lethality? And then the second part of that question, tell me how the department is planning to address these harmful beliefs.
Certainly, Congresswoman. I really appreciate the several of you culminating here who've raised this issue that those who are affected by sexual harassment, sexual assault, first of all, are not just women, and second of all, the disproportionate percent who are LGBTQ plus representative of I can't do it again, I'm sorry, LGBTQ plus community. So I think one of the key things we're doing in terms of inclusion really is this diversity, equity, and inclusion initiative set that we have underway for the Deputies Workforce Council that I chair. And that is itself a whole set of initiatives looking significantly at around training and education, around recruitment and retention, and promotion is a significant piece of that. We see major drop-off in non-white male populations as we move up through, particularly obviously in the general and flag officer ranks, but even as we move up through the senior NCO ranks, and then in the officer ranks as you move up. So we are trying to get after how to change some of those dynamics. And by the way, that's controlling for factors. I just want to make that clear. That's controlling for all kinds of factors. So you can really start to see that it really does appear to be a distinguisher only with regard to somebody's ethnic or racial background or gender. So we're looking at those issues at the same time that we are looking at, through the prism of sexual harassment, sexual assault, looking at this set of prevention and climate and victim care approaches that we think can raise the boats, if you will, for many other issues. All the ones you've just mentioned, but I will also say regarding self-harm, so things like suicide and other outcomes, violence outcomes that occur to people who are in these underrepresented communities.
Right. Well, thank you very much for that. We know that sexual assault is often about power and control, and some of the disparities that we see in regard to race is often conscious or unconscious bias. So thank you so much for your thoughtful answers, and thank you for taking accountability for this. Madam Chair, I yield back.
Gentlewoman yields back. The gentleman from Maryland, Mr. Brown, is recognized for 5 minutes.
Thank you, Madam Chair, and I thank the committee for allowing me to wave on for the purpose of this hearing. Good afternoon, Dr. Hicks. Madam Chair, first I ask for unanimous consent to enter 2 items into the record. I think committee staff should have them. One is a 1952 article regarding military opposition to desegregation of the armed forces, and the other is a 1972 report from President Nixon's task force on racial disparities in the military.
Without objection, so ordered.
Thank you, Dr. Hicks. Under the Vanessa Guillen Act that's been introduced, and let me preface by saying, I've served as a commander in the Army at 2 levels. I served as a JAG. I've advised commanders with court-martial convening authority. I understand the importance of the punitive articles and the procedures, non-judicial punishment in the Uniform Code of Military Justice as an important tool to maintain good order and discipline. In this act, the commanders retain the authority to issue non-judicial punishment. They retain authority over military-specific crimes, dereliction of duty, AWOL, malingering, insubordination, the list goes on. And they also retain the ability to refer charges to special court-martial, for example, simple assault, right? The dining facility fight. Can you explain the department's thinking why those are not sufficient tools to maintain good order and discipline for a commander?
Congressman Brown, we have not looked, as I said, we have not looked at this issue set. We looked very broadly and then very deeply on sexual assault and sexual harassment. We have not taken on, and there aren't studies other than the one I mentioned that the department or department-related bodies have done looking at what it would take or what the implications would be. What I will tell you is our focus right now, and as I sit before you right now, is making sure we get it right on the sexual harassment, sexual assault, and related crimes.
Then let me ask you a follow-up on
please
that,
do.
and I appreciate that. So the DOD, the department's proposal for reform, only partially implements the recommendations of the IRC. Notably, and correct me if I'm wrong, Notably, the department only establishes one of the recommended 3 special victims categories. I think one of them is, which the department accepts, are the specified offenses, but does not accept the trait of victim, category number 2, and category number 3 is intent of offender. Now, you have acknowledged, the department has acknowledged the complexity of these cases, the need to follow best practices, special victims units, which we see in DA's offices around the country. And they do that so that they can take on all 3 categories as recommended by the IRC. The IRC also recommended that there be judge order military protective orders. So I guess my question is, the department, after decades, has resisted change. I think a 60-day or 90-day review by the IRC, very comprehensive, very capable and knowledgeable people. They've come back with robust recommendations to address sexual assault. Why is the department not accepting their recommendations in their entirety?
The department is looking ahead, not just at the legal piece of this, but at the change, implementation, and management side of it. And in doing that and weighing the advice inside the department, outside experts like the IRC, the approach really is this balance of how do we implement change that has real effect quickly, meaningfully, and that can withstand challenge. I'm sure you know the UCMJ changes. The UCMJ are frequently challenged in court. We saw the Australians, when they moved to an outside system, that actually was thrown out by the Australian Supreme Court, and so they had to restart. So
but we also know that
let
me just say, in this country, the courts have deferred tremendously to both the executive branch and Congress in implementing the rules that regulate the armed forces. I mean, they really have. So I'm just really concerned because, for example, in that category 2, trait of victim, you could have a scenario where you have intimate partners and where one partner is stealing from the other partner as a form of abuse. And I'm not sure if just following category 1 specified offenses that would qualify as an offense that would be now under this new system. Yeah.
Congressman, I completely understand. The same thing will happen if you make a 1-year differentiation. So
well, the reason why I beg to differ, again, going to best practices, and if you didn't just indulge me, Madam Chair, I do believe in best practices. And when you look at the best practices in U.S. attorneys' offices and in DAs, they have felony divisions and they have misdemeanor divisions. And there is overlap in those divisions. Within felony divisions, you have special victims units. And those special victims units are much more comprehensive than what the department is willing to accept from the IRC. You took members with tremendous amount of experience, created an IRC, yet are coming back and only embracing a much narrow subset of what they're recommending. And that's on the special victims piece, not the felony misdemeanor piece. So that's my concern. I've been hearing a lot about best practices, but yet I'm not really hearing the adoption of best practices. And if I can just complete on this point, Madam Chair, I've heard a lot about solving the problem. For 10 years, we've brought this problem. Commanders have it, commanders have it, commanders have it. Finally, after a 90-day review, commanders didn't have it, we recognize. And why? It really comes down to a data set that soldiers, sailors, airmen, Marines, and Guardians don't trust commanders. That's the primary data set here, the lack of trust, and that's why we're taking it away from the commanders. I put into the record a 1972 study. What they found was a lack of trust. Black and brown service members in commanders. This issue has been around for a long time. The problem can be simplified. It's not a simple problem. It's an under-prosecution of sexual assault and an over-prosecution of black and brown people. We know the problem. There's a lack of trust between black and brown and commanders in the military justice system, and there's an opportunity to address that. Just like we believe removing from the commanders referral of charges, sexual assaults, to solve this lack of trust problem, we can do the same thing with a broader set of offenses. Because I heard someone from the department recently say, well, the sexual assault's it's a pressing problem right now, and nobody will disagree with that.
But the over-prosecution of black and brown people in the military justice system, and when capital punishment was issued in the military justice system, over-representation of black men being prosecuted and found guilty of capital punishment in the military. That's a pressing problem. And yet we have an opportunity here to begin addressing it. And what I haven't heard from the department is, well, we don't want to do the sweeping reform, but can you at least give us some more tools? And all I'm hearing is, we'll fix it. And that's what we've heard for 10 years for sexual assault. Thank you, Madam Chair. I yield back.
Expired. Dr. Hicks, we have a vote on, and I think we're going to conclude this part of the hearing. We want to thank you very much for the swift action with which you have undertaken the request by the Secretary and the President, and we're deeply indebted to you for the professionalism that you've shown and that the Commission has shown as well. I'm going to just ask you this question for the record, and then if you can respond to us. The prevention portion of the IRC's report calls for a major expansion of prevention workforce, and I would like to know what the timeline is to execute on that, how many people you are anticipating hiring, are they civilian, are they military, and what are their roles going to be? So if you could provide that to us for the record. All right, and with that, we will stand in recess for about an hour because we have 3 votes. Thank you.
It's exhausting. The ACFT.
The Military Personnel Subcommittee will return from its recess now, and we are going to welcome our second panel. We're joined by the chair of the Independent Review Commission on Sexual Assault in the Military, Ms. Lynn Rosenthal. Welcome. Major General James Johnson is retired, also a member of the Independent Review Commission on Sexual Assault in the Military. Dr. Kylene, what's the right? Kylan Hunter, also a member of the Independent Review Commission, and Ms. Christina Rose, another member of the commission, and Ms. Tokash, who is not in my notes here, but welcome as well. I understand you all have submitted a joint statement, and Ms. Rosenthal will speak on behalf of the IRC. After Ms. Rosenthal's statement, each member will have an opportunity to question the witnesses for 5 minutes. We respectfully ask that witnesses summarize their testimony in 5 minutes. Your written comments and statements will be made part of the hearing record. And with that, Ms. Rosenthal, we welcome you.
Thank you, Congresswoman, and thank you for your leadership over all these many years, Ranking Member Gallagher and other distinguished members of the subcommittee. Thank you for the opportunity to present the findings and recommendations of the Independent Review Commission on Sexual Assault in the Military. I also want to recognize the leadership of Secretary Austin and Dr. Hicks and the service leaders who met with the IRC and shared their views. The IRC was comprised of 12 highly qualified experts from outside the Department of Defense, 3 of whom are with me today. 5 of the IRC's members were former military commanders, and 2 served as judge advocates. As you know, the IRC made 82 recommendations across 4 lines of effort: accountability, prevention, climate and culture, and victim care and support. Because leadership is at the heart of military culture and unit climate, these recommendations target leaders at all levels. For decades, as you all know, service leaders have said that there is no tolerance for sexual harassment and that sexual assault has no place in our military. And yet, in the daily lives of service members, sexual harassment goes unchecked and sexual assault is poorly handled. This has resulted in broken trust between service members and commanders. This damaged trust has consequences for the military justice system, which the IRC found is ill-equipped to handle crimes like sexual assault. The current system puts legal decisions about these complex cases in the hands of commanders whose leadership is better suited to other aspects of sexual assault prevention and response. Sexual assault and related crimes can be re-traumatizing for victims and create the perception of conflict of interest for commanders. They require greater specialization and sensitivity to the complex dynamics that are often present. For these reasons, the IRC has recommended shifting decisions about sexual assault and related criminal prosecutions to experienced special victims prosecutors outside the chain of command. We recommend that these special victim prosecutors have civilian oversight within the Department of Defense. The IRC emphasizes, however, that making changes to the military justice system alone will not reduce sexual assault. Investing in prevention, improving command climates, and enhancing victim care are equally necessary. The IRC's climate and culture experts identified outdated social and gender norms that contribute to a culture of hostility toward women, increasing the risk of sexual harassment and assault. We also found that the cyber domain can be as strong an influence on unit climate as real-time interactions, and that leaders are poorly equipped to deal with this ever-changing environment. We've made a series of recommendations to improve unit climate, including better methods to select, develop, and evaluate leaders. The IRC found critical deficiencies throughout the workforce charged with responding to sexual harassment and assault. These deficiencies have multiple causes, including frequent rotations of service members in essential positions and underfunded mandates. This is particularly apparent in victim care, where there are thousands of collateral duty victim advocates, many of whom are voluntold to serve as their unit's advocate in the off hours. This practice results in poor care for victims. In the military justice system, the lack of dedicated career tracks and billets for prosecutors, investigators, and special victims counsel results in a critical lack of experience. One survivor told us that over the course of her case, she had 2 different prosecution teams and 4 different special victims counsel. These workforce deficiencies also extend to prevention. These activities or prevention responsibilities are often assigned to personnel who lack the capacity to design, implement, and evaluate science-based prevention initiatives. The military requires the resources to make long-term investments in a prevention workforce if we want to move the needle. It is also in the best interest of DoD and the services to learn more about the risk they take in recruiting members to the force, and this includes studying and piloting compatibility assessments. And alarmingly, the IRC found critical failings in victim care and support. Every survivor that we interviewed told us that they regretted making a report, whether restricted or unrestricted. Nearly all the survivors who we heard from had contemplated or attempted suicide. Recommendations to improve victim care include shifting sexual assault response coordinators out of the command structure, and victim advocates as well, largely eliminating collateral duty victim advocates and expanding access to behavioral health services. And we have a number of recommendations in that regard. Because of the IRC's urgent concern for victim safety and well-being, we recommend that this area be prioritized for immediate action. We also identified the related need to improve the response to domestic violence, which is inherently linked to sexual assault. The IRC recognizes that our report presents a challenging picture, but we believe that with leadership and resources, significant progress can and will be made. And I'm joined by Megan Tokash from our accountability line of effort, Kai Hunter from our climate and culture line of effort, and James Johnson from our prevention line of effort. And as you noted, Chris Rose is also here with us today from the victim care and support. So we're happy to answer questions.
Thank you, Ms. Rosenthal. I must say that in reading this report, I was so impressed and clear that you all, in a very short period of time, got it. And it's just reassuring to those of us who've been working in this issue area for so long that we weren't going crazy, that in fact there were those professionals who could come in and look at the problem and recognize the issues. Let me start by asking you this, Chairwoman. Protective orders. 2/3 of our service members live off base, 1/3 on base, and the protective orders that exist right now are from the commander. They don't carry any weight outside of the base, and there's a growing need to create these military protective orders that are issued by a military judge. You recommend that in your report. It is not in the department's recommendations. Can you explain why it's so important to change this in the system? Yes, Megan Tokash, we welcome you.
Thank you, ma'am. Every county, tribe, and territory in the United States of America has complied with the full faith and credit clause of the United States Constitution. The IRC believes that the military can and should do the same. This is something that is not controversial. Creating judge-issued military protective orders its time has come in the military. Just as you said, ma'am, over 60% of service members live off of installations, and to be able to have military protective orders that are enforceable both on and off military installations, is critical. This is a victim-facing issue. It is a safety issue and is one that needs to be addressed now.
Thank you. Dr. Hunter, the command climate surveys we found from the Fort Hood Independent Review Committee were not even being reviewed. Tell us what the Commission's recommendations are on climate surveys, and how is that going to change the dynamic?
Yes, thank you so much, ma'am, for that question. As you noted, that command climate surveys, particularly DEOCs, which are done once a year, do have a very important role, but there are over 100 questions on them. They are often not released in a timely fashion, and there is no accountability mechanism to hold commanders accountable for addressing what those deficiencies are. So our recommendation here centers around, one, a study to look at what tools would be effective for commanders, but more than that, the introduction of pulse surveys, which would be quick, 3 to 5 questions done on a regular intervals, and that's really up to services and installations to determine what that intervals is, but they provide real-time, actionable, and easy to understand information for the commanders, because commanders can't fix what they don't know is happening there. And time again, we heard from commanders that they just didn't know how big or bad issues were there. So this is an essential tool. We saw this implemented in Fort Hood by the Fort Hood IRC, and it provided incredible information to commands there as to really the depth and breadth of the problem that we
I think
see.
the VA is using that system now.
Yes, they are, ma'am. And they are a very important best practice to look at when we look at what oversight to actually implement this would be.
Doctor, would you restate the story you just told me that actually made my heart sink about the service member in Iraq? I guess
In Iraq? Yes, ma'am. PFC Johnson, she was found in her tent in 2005, Iraq, dead. Her death was ruled a suicide. However, autopsy report revealed rape and battery had occurred, and yet they closed the case. They said no more. Her family is continuing to press for answers, and the Army isn't reopening or addressing her case. And so when we really think about getting at the depth of issues on campus, and she has huge intersectional issues when you look at the impact of racial discrimination, ethnic discrimination, some of the MOS discrimination that exists. And so giving commanders tools to actually understand the depth of what's going on in their commands is absolutely essential.
Thank you. Ms. Tokash, I worked for a period of time on the issue of sexual harassment in Congress. And as a result of that effort, we passed a House rule that requires members, actually it's an act, requires members, if they are found to have sexually harassed or they settle in a sexual harassment case, that the settlement would not come from the taxpayers, but would come from the members' pockets. And I thought that was a way of establishing accountability and hopefully to discourage that kind of behavior. I'm trying to grapple with how do we compensate the victims of sexual harassment and sexual assault in the military where there has been negligence by the command in not providing the care and justice, and how do we hold the perpetrators accountable as well? Do you have any thoughts on that?
Yes, ma'am. Under the current construct, there is no civil avenue of recourse in the military for military service members who experience sexual harassment to be able to seek compensation from other military members. One of the recommendations, however, that we made as an IRC was we believe deeply that there should be a mandatory restitution provision for victims of sexual harassment and sexual assault within the military context that mirrors the Mandatory Victims Restitution Act of 1996. It's really a matter of equity when you think about it. Just because you are sexually harassed or sexually assaulted in the military should not be a bar to be able to seek a form of restitution. So that's why we made that recommendation. Now, we left it up to the department to understand how and what that would look like. But we as a commission felt very strongly that, again, as a matter of equity, members who are sexually harassed in the military or sexually assaulted in the military should have equal access to justice in the form of restitution.
Thank you. My colleague, Mr. Gallagher, is recognized for 7 minutes.
Thank you. Online harassment is mentioned throughout your report, and Ms. Rosenthal, I appreciated very much your comments about the importance and salience of prevention in this space. But I'd be curious, sort of with prevention in mind and the complexities of online harassment in mind, I mean, what preventative tools work well in that space, and what do you think commanders and leaders are missing about online harassment?
I'm going to turn first to Kai Hunter because this is her area of expertise, and then to James Johnson to talk about prevention.
Thank you.
Thank you so much, sir, for this question. As you noted, online harassment is a huge problem, and one of the biggest findings from the commission, and it's something that you are all well aware of from your oversight hearings as well, is that there is a huge gulf between what the most senior leaders in our military know and have experienced in the online community and what our junior, especially junior enlisted service members, know and experience in the online community, primarily with the idea of just being digital natives. To our junior enlisted service member, our junior young officers, what happens in the online world is real, and it has just as big an impact on them as what happens in face-to-face interactions. So one of the first things that needed, and this goes back to the ideas of surveys and climate surveys, is deliberate efforts in actually tracking the prevalence of online harassment. We know that there is a continuum, and that often what starts as harassment in the online world extends into the physical world, especially when we start talking about cyber stalking. We know from the one survey that's been done of this, 30% of service members who had been harassed said it was online. So this is real. So one is first being deliberate in getting that information out there. The next is when we think about command and preparing people for command as part of our overall understanding of that care and welfare for our service members, we need to also extend that to what happens online. We talk a lot about what it is to take care of our people in the physical space. That training needs to extend into the online space, as well as when we start to look at social media policies that are out there. This isn't just about putting out classified information about troop movements, which is where a big focus is, but is what do those interactions that are part of good order and discipline mean? I mean, stories that we got from focus groups on this where junior E2, E3s were getting friended or followed on Facebook by their staff sergeants and gunnies. And then they start to get confused as to, well, what's an order when they comment on something essentially? What are they being directed to do versus what is sort of friendly online banter? How that then extended into how they were treated in their workplace and isolated for not liking the right type of pictures or being judged for what they wore when they were on vacation when they come back to work. So that needs to be part of, too, when we look at what it is as a commander to maintain that good order and discipline. We really need to be thinking about the cyber world, too, and how social media plays into those day-to-day interactions. And I'll turn it over now to James to talk about the specific prevention side of it.
Thank you. Thanks for the question, Congressman. I think for prevention, for the line of effort that I was fortunate to work with Deb Bowery from the CDC and Mr. Neil Irvin from Men Can Stop Rape, what we would tell you is that there are a couple of touch points. One, leadership. And we found a void in the ability for leaders to really lead in prevention. So that's the first one. And it was really leadership at every level. So oftentimes when we say leadership, somebody might think about a leader at installation level, commander. We're talking at every level, from the Secretary of Defense all the way down to that first line, first the line supervisor, NCO, and where they're engaging with the members who might be engaged in this kind of activity, and actually giving them the competencies to engage with those members in a way that builds a protective environment and lowers the risk factors. So that's one touch point I would say is leadership and developing the competencies in our leaders that don't exist today. As we engaged with in every engagement that this line of effort had, and we engaged at the strategic, operational, tactical level. We talked with 4-star level down to the newest members who'd just been, in their units for maybe a year or two. And in every engagement, they all recognize leaders want to lead, they don't know how to lead in prevention. And it's because they don't have those specific competencies. That's one touch point. The other touch point I would say is research. And we found there's this dearth in the kind of research capability that the department really needs to be able to have to attack these kinds of issues in a very comprehensive way. Today, it's a little bit of a pickup game when it comes to exploring an agenda-driven research agenda that would get after something like you're talking about. And so I think that's one. The other touch point would be actual strategies. So in the report, we talk about community-focused interventions, and this would fall into kind of promoting healthy social norms. And so I would say it would be in that realm with leaders who have the competencies and with the research that tells you exactly what works and what doesn't work, and then using interventions appropriately. I think that's a place that we would find more success.
And then in the short period of time I have, Ms. Rosenthal, I believe you mentioned a number of comorbidities in your opening statements on sexual assault and suicide. And I'd just be curious when it comes to that question, how do we get after these comorbidities so we can really make a lasting change for service members and their families?
Well, there are two very critical issues. One is to professionalize the victim advocacy workforce, largely eliminate collateral duty victim advocates, and expand access to behavioral health care. So, for example, active duty, Guard, and Reserve members can, by federal law, seek behavioral health services through the VA, but in current implementation at the DoD level, the number of providers is limited to 300 providers when there's actually 1,000 VA facilities that could receive those referrals or not. The law allows for victims to seek that care even without a referral and to receive it confidentially.
Thank you. I yield back.
Gentleman yields back. Dr. Hunter, when you were talking about the confusion that young soldiers have, I remember a young airman at Lackland Air Force Base who, when her military training instructor told her to meet him in the storage room, she says there was no question mark at the end of that sentence. That stayed with me all these years. Now the gentleman from New Jersey, Mr. Kim, is recognized for 5 minutes.
Thank you. Thank you, Chairwoman. I wanted to just pick up on a thread that I had raised before with the Deputy Secretary. I had asked her about the IRC recommendations, talking about the special victims crimes and referring certain alleged crimes to a special victims prosecutor. And our understanding of this is that this would include sexual assault, but also other crimes based on relationship and the vulnerability of the victim, domestic abuse, child abuse, hate crimes, or hazing. I wanted to just get a better sense for the IRC's rationale in defining these categories in the way that they did. So I wanted to just kind of hear a little bit more from you about how that was constructed and why you felt like that was the best way to frame these buckets.
Thank you, sir. The IRC found that these crimes tend to be interpersonal in nature, and that victims who have to navigate through the military justice process often experience re-traumatization because of their experiences going through that process. The IRC came up with 3 categories that comprise the special victims scheme. And the first one is very plain on its face. It's those categories that of crimes that are inherently special victims crimes, so rape, sexual assault, etc. The second was based on the trait of the victim, or more importantly, the perceived trait of the victim, and why those particular victims might be targeted by a certain perpetrator. So it may be their perception that they are gay, or it may be their perception, that they are of a certain religion. The third category that the IRC identified was based on the motivation of the offender. And we arrived at and landed on hazing and bullying as well, which we know is very prevalent in the military. So based on what we heard from hundreds of survivors, hundreds of military justice practitioners and academics with whom we spoke and interacted over the course of 90 days, as an IRC, we landed on these three categories that comprise the special victims context, again, mainly because of the interpersonal nature of these crimes and the penchant for victims to be re-traumatized through the military justice process.
Thank you. That's helpful. And that was helpful to hear, both in terms of how you're framing when it comes to the victims, but also, as you said, there was an element in terms of the offender and the perpetrator. And, I think when I kind of look at the situations when it comes to sexual assault prevention, for a long time, there's been so much focused on the victim, rightfully so. And one of the most interesting findings in the IRC report is just how little we understand about the actual perpetrators. So I guess I wanted to just follow up with this question there about, what kind of resources do you think we need to have to better understand how to identify perpetrators? And how can we screen for these signs before the perpetrator were to take actions? How are we trying to understand how to be able to do that, and then also be able to find ways to retrain and redirect this behavior? So I wanted to just get a little bit more of a sense of that.
James, this is an area that the prevention line of effort looked at very closely.
Thank you. Thank you for the question. It really does, a lot of it falls into that research recommendation that we made on the compatibility assessment. And we recognize that today the department assumes risk because they don't know, what the attitudes and behaviors are for those people that they're recruiting and assessing into the military. And so one of the services has developed a compatibility assessment that we recommended the Secretary approve for operational testing within the MEPS, and to start to at least learn more about the attitudes and behaviors of individuals they're assessing, and that would inform potential interventions that could kind of run the gambit of what the outcomes could be from those interventions, but it would be the starting point. Thank you.
Thank you. Chairwoman, I yield back. Thank you.
The gentleman yields back. Ms. McLean from, is it Missouri? Michigan is recognized for 5 minutes.
Thank you, Madam Chair, and I want to thank all the witnesses for being here today. As a freshman member of Congress and obviously a freshman member on this committee, it saddens me to talk about what we're talking about today and to know that our brave men and women in the military are experiencing this. It's unacceptable, and quite frankly, it's embarrassing. So I applaud everyone in their efforts to try and figure out the root cause and fix it. In layman's terms, what I'm trying to understand is the actual process. So if we take it out of the commander's or the military's hands, would it look exactly like it would look as if you were civilian? So I guess my question simply is, can you explain what the process would look like in layman's terms?
Yes. So even if you took the decision to prefer, that is indict, or refer, that is to send that indictment to trial, out of the hands of commanders and place that decision squarely in the hands of military lawyers, the system will still look somewhat different from the civilian system because there are certain aspects of military justice that are just inherently different than the civilian system of justice. For example, where I practice in federal district court in the Western District of New York, I take my cases before a grand jury. The grand jury decides by vote whether I have a bill and whether that case will actually be indicted. There's no equal procedure in the military. There's no grand jury mechanism in military justice. So I just say that as a preface, that there are going to be certain things that still will not make them directly analogous. So to answer your question, all that is going to happen by virtue of our recommendation, that the decision to prefer, that is indict, or refer, that is to send charges to a general or special court-martial, is that a military lawyer will be making those decisions in the sexual harassment and sexual assault context versus a military commander. Now, to be fair, a military commander just does not make this decision in a vacuum. A military commander is advised by senior staff judge advocates. However, the IRC's concern was that these senior staff judge advocates are so far removed from the practice of trial law that their advice to the convening authority in a very short period of time, when they sit knee to knee with that convening authority to determine one of several military justice matters, does not do that particular case justice.
So I think I understand that piece, that the lawyer would indict, so to speak, to use your term. But there's also another, if I heard you correctly, and I just want to make sure I did, there's also another piece that we need to make sure that we're focusing on, which is there has to be, after due process, of course, but there has to be a consequence to the action, right? So I know you have the preventative end, which it sounds like we're trying at least to put things in place, and it looks like we're on the right path. It looks like we're trying to do the indictment end, so to speak. What are we doing for the consequence end? Because it seems like that piece might be missing a little bit as well. And I don't know if I heard you correctly, but I didn't hear the talk of the, the consequence end.
Yeah, so there are two avenues of approach in the military. The first is the judicial approach, and the second is the non-judicial approach. Both approaches which currently are in the hands of military commanders today. Our recommendation is that the judicial approach in sexual harassment and sexual assault cases be taken away from commanders and placed into the hands of military lawyers, independent military lawyers.
So on the consequence end as well?
So on the consequence end, in the judicial sector, the punishment, if there is a conviction at court-martial, would be meted out by either a military judge or military court-martial panel members.
So is that changing?
That would not change, though we did make a recommendation that military judges alone decide the punishment phase, and we have detailed reasons for that in our report. But the second sector, if you will, that is non-judicial punishment, will, under the IRC construct, remain in the hands of commanders. And as a commission, we found that this is very important, especially in the prevention and response context, because the IRC wants commanders to remain involved. We want commanders to be involved in this system so that their troops that they lead can see that they have a skin in the game, that they care. The non-judicial punishment sector, if you will, for lack of a better term, also has punishment that can be attached to it too, including loss of rank and loss of pay and restriction and those sorts of things. The punishments at the non-judicial end are not as severe as punishment at a court-martial. So currently, the commander has two different avenues of approach, judicial and non-judicial punishment, both of which have punishment mechanisms in place.
I'm out of time. I appreciate your patience. Thank you very much.
Of course.
Well, it's an important topic. I think it's important to point out that if they go to court-martial and are convicted, they can be jailed, They can be separated from the military. They can lose rank. There's a whole series of actions that can take place. One of the areas, and I don't know if you looked at it, that I continue to be concerned about is that many of these individuals are sexual predators and should then be on the registry, civilian sex offender registries, and they are not being communicated by the military to that registry, and so they then go out of the military and then conduct themselves in a similar fashion. So I don't think you addressed that in your report, did you?
We didn't address that specific issue, but we did note a low number of registrants on the sexual offense registry. And one of the other pieces that's important about what Megan said is that with our specialized special victims prosecutor, well-trained cadre without these constant rotations, we anticipate that over time we will see increased convictions leading to greater accountability. There is a problem in the military justice system. It's been called the Achilles heel of the military justice system, and that is inexperienced, although well-intended, prosecutors who don't have the real ability to try these cases effectively.
The gentlewoman from Texas, Ms. Escobar, is recognized for 5 minutes.
Thank you, Madam Chair. And I am so grateful to all of you for your work, your recommendations, and for your advocacy. You've provided us such important, critical information, and I'm very grateful. I represent El Paso, Texas, and Fort Bliss is the military installation, one of those that has been identified for its rate of women who are vulnerable to, or victims rather, who are vulnerable to sexual assault and sexual harassment. One of the things that, many of the lessons that I have learned have come from mostly women who have told me stories or cases that I have learned about through Fort Bliss, through what's happened at Fort Bliss. In one case, the perpetrator had assaulted multiple women before there was a soldier who came forward and filed a complaint. And we know that perpetrators who frequently harass multiple people, that it's not a one-time offense until they are finally held accountable. And these are people who display a pattern, and the pattern generally doesn't stop. And one of the things that I'm wondering, especially after Representative Kim noted that there's so little that we know about perpetrators, I've been very curious about repeat offenders and the way that they're able to operate until they're finally held accountable. Did you all at all study or look into that, to repeat offenses?
We recommend that the CATCH program be expanded. So this is where somebody who has not made an unrestricted report is able to note the name of the offender and see if there's a match with other entries in that same system. And we recommend that this system be expanded so that it includes sexual harassment, because these serial sexual harassers can also be your serial assaulters. And also that we make a number of improvements so that victims can more readily enter information into that system. So we felt that that was one way to get to this issue of serial offenders.
Great, thank you. And Ms. Rosenthal, you mentioned earlier, and it's in the report, and it's incredibly heartbreaking, but that women regretted reporting. Can you expand a little bit more on why?
Women regret, and victims, not just women, but men as well, regret reporting because they're treated so poorly when they do so. They're bullied or ostracized by their peers, and the commanders don't step in and take action to prevent that from happening. Even when they're not being bullied by their commander specifically, the commanders are not taking action against that pattern. They're not treated with the kind of dignity and respect that we would think they deserve. They're not given time off to go to their medical or their legal appointments, and they're not believed. And things are said to them by command and by peers that they're lying, that they're trying to ruin someone's career. I cannot tell you how many times we heard that. You're out to hurt this person. There's this great myth among at all levels of the service that victims are not telling the truth, that they have some other kind of agenda. And of course, we did not find that to be true. And we know that rates of false reporting are quite low. So that's part of it. And the second piece, and what makes this different than the civilian society, where sexual assault is, of course, very traumatic for all victims, is the 24-hour nature of military life. So there's nothing they can do if policies are not being followed. For example, if they're not getting an expedited transfer when they want one, then they don't have a way to remedy the situation for themselves. They can't leave. They can't just leave. And so they feel trapped. And because they feel so trapped, they regret that they ever came forward in the first place. So many women said, when I saw what this victim went through, I will tell you that I myself would never make a report. And that is heartbreaking.
Thank you so much. And I'm quickly running out of time. I want to just point something else out because I think we need to think through this. I'm not sure if you all have. But in the case of Vanessa Guillen, as an example, she had reached out to her family to let them know what had happened to her. There's a case at Fort Bliss of a young woman who committed suicide recently, and she had reached out to her family and alleged a sexual assault as well. There's no other information attached to it, but I keep thinking that there are so many families who probably need tools on how they can help as well, especially younger soldiers. I think, I'm a mother. If my children reached out to me and told me they were victims and they were in the military, I don't know what I would do. And so I think that's another area for us to explore. I know I'm out of time. Thank you so much, Madam Chair.
Would you like to respond? I think you've raised an interesting piece about our no wrong door approach. And when we think of no wrong door, we think about it for victims themselves and that wherever they go, they should be able to get help. But I really like the way you frame this question. What is it we can do for families? Because sexual assault affects the entire family. It affects spouses. It affects everyone. So I think it's a really excellent question for us to consider.
The gentlewoman yields back. The gentleman from Texas, Mr. Jackson, is recognized for 5 minutes.
Thank you, Madam Chair. I think, Ms. Tokesh, you actually answered most of my questions a while ago in previous ones, so I'll be brief here. But I was just what I want to say is that, a sexual assault report is one of the most sensitive issues that a commander would have to deal with. And I'll be honest with you, I think it's a double-edged sword. I think even though most commanders don't want to relinquish any of the authority they have as commander, a lot of them would be kind of relieved to pass some of this on, to someone else. It's just not something that they want to, that they want to be confronted with. It's kind of a no-win situation a lot of times for them as well, I think. But I know that the handling, you were talking about the way this progresses. Most commanders, a lot of them, I guess, have their own JAG officers that are in their chain of command. Many of them don't. But the ones that do have have a JAG as part of their chain of command, I'm assuming they utilize their own judge advocates in doing this. Do they? And then the ones that don't, I guess, are forced to go outside if they want to get advice from the judge advocate. Do most commanders going through this process, do they seek out information from the JAG officer, and do they follow that information?
So the IRC heard, sir, that from certain commanders, both past and present, that they actually would be relieved to relinquish the prosecutorial responsibilities and have those responsibilities kept with a military prosecutor. Most of the commanders that we spoke with also said that they do seek the advice of their lawyer. However, our commission was very much informed by the Defense Advisory Committee on Sexual Assault in the Military's 2017 data that highlighted 73 cases where a judicial officer found no probable cause to believe a crime existed, yet nonetheless, that senior JAG advised that senior commander that the case should be sent forward to trial. Now, probable cause is a constitutional threshold issue in the United States of America. Sending a case to trial where a preliminary hearing officer found no probable cause does not serve victims of sexual assault and does not serve those who are suspected of sexual assault. And interestingly enough, out of those 73 cases, 71 ended in acquittal. And of the 2 that didn't end in acquittal, One of the two of them were overturned on appeal. So that is part of the broken trust that the IRC found as it pertains to command having prosecutorial decision-making.
Yeah, I tend to agree with that a little bit too as well, because I think a lot of it is, if you're a commander, a lot of your attitude is just a kind of a CYA attitude, and that's probably not good for anybody in the long run. So I was going to ask, so it looks like the plan is to remove this from the chain of command, keep it within the military, but put it in a separate chain. Is there any talk about removing this completely and completely civilianizing this process? And you know, I don't think that's a good idea in my personal opinion, but is that being discussed, and what would be the issue there?
Sir, the IRC's recommendation was that there would be civilian oversight in terms of a senior civilian who would fall underneath the Secretary of Defense. Now, the department disagreed with us. They have that as a backup plan in the ledge prop that came over to the Hill. So we felt strongly as a commission that the civilian oversight was important as a control function, but also that the civilian not only have civilian experience, but prior military justice experience. This whole world view or complete picture is very important, because another finding we made as an IRC under recommendation 1.4 is that resistance to change among senior leaders in the JAG Corps is both historic and entrenched. So we were very informed by those who we spoke with, including services TJAGs, who we sat face-to-face with, and they told us what their opinion was of specializing their JAG Corps. And the resistance to change was very apparent. So that's why we felt very strongly that civilian oversight, not absolute control, but oversight was important. And it's also important to note that the IRC construct, this concept of the Office of the Special Victim Prosecutor, capitalizes on using existing billets. So we're not talking about creating a brand new bureaucracy or an unwieldy bureaucracy. These billets already exist. There are already special victim prosecutors among the services JAG Corps. The IRC recommends just rebranding them, appointing a head special victim prosecutor, one or two for each of the services, depending on what the needs of the services are, and that office be supervised by a civilian SES with OSD oversight.
Thank you, ma'am. I appreciate that.
Thank you, sir.
I think I'm out of time. Thank you.
Gentleman's time has expired. The gentleman from Texas, Mr. Vesey, is recognized for 5 minutes.
Madam Chair, thank you very much. We had a very interesting with the chairwoman. We had a very interesting visit to Fort Hood to talk about some of the issues around sexual, racial harassment on military bases. And I wanted to just ask you about some of the off-the-record conversations that we had with officers and enlistees about some of the microaggressions. And because I noticed in the report that there was a section in here just on the climate and culture, and there really does seem to be a problem in that area. And I think that they're trying to address that and take it more seriously. But was just curious, like how you think some of these changes will help in those areas. I think that one of the areas where we have a lot of issues are the sort of everyday, slights that women face, that minorities face, that really just come secondhand to so many people, and they don't really realize that they're making those, that they're doing things like that. Like, for instance, one officer, told us that, you look nice today, but you can't say that. We may get in trouble if we say something like that. Can you talk about how you just think that that some of these changes might help in those areas? Because I think that is a really, really big deal and should be a big concern.
I want to turn to Kai Hunter for this question.
Please, yeah.
Yes, thank you so much, sir, for highlighting this. I think across the board in the entire commission, and in particular in the climate and culture line of effort, we found that these lingering attitudes, beliefs, behaviors didn't just hurt individuals, but have a real, meaningful, and in my opinion, terrifying impact on our national security. If we think just about the sexual harassment side of this and these smaller slights, a recent study found that the military loses over 16,000 manpower hours a year because of people leaving because of these things. And so it's a real national security issue. We also see that in the most recent OPA's data on propensity to serve, that young women have half of the propensity to serve of men of similar demographics there because of fear of being harassed. And that's their rationale, that I'm afraid of this. So we are losing out on key recruitment intention at a time in our history where it is critical that we are able to recruit and retain from the entire force population. So when you look at our recommendations, and I think in particular the recommendations that we have around selecting the right leaders and using real qualitative data to back up the quantitative data that's there, is going to have a big impact, not just on addressing sexual harassment and assault, but on addressing so many of these everyday microaggressions that you're talking about here and there. Because harassment, hate, assault all exist on a continuum. Someone who is a sexual predator likely holds other damaging beliefs as well that are there. So when we think about selecting these right leaders, what we are basing this on is the fact that people fight our wars, and that without the ability to recruit and retain those talented young women and men that we have there, it doesn't matter how tactically competent you are as a commander, you are failing our country that is there, and you are failing these brave women and men who signed up. So we really do believe that using a more comprehensive selection mechanism, using these climate surveys that are going to give real-time feedback to commanders and actionable, understandable information there, equipping them with the knowledge and skills based on their level that's there, is not only going to address sexual harassment and assault, but will have these cascading impacts that you're talking about.
Yeah, and that was one thing that we heard from several people, was that your decision whether or not you're going to re-up depends on what sort of support you have with your NCO or your CO, and that was made very clear to us. One other thing that I was concerned about when we were on our visit, mental health. So if someone reports a sexual harassment, a sexual assault claim, how will you make sure that if they need to seek mental health services, that it won't impact them losing their security clearance or gaining a higher security clearance? I know that was one area that people were very concerned about, and obviously if you've experienced something like a sexual assault or any sort of of assault on your person, that could obviously also have a mental trauma. So can you address how you would work out that very delicate situation?
We did not assess the security clearance issue, which I know has been a long-term project of the department, and some efforts have been made. And in the past, sexual assault reports were not required. Sexual assault treatment was not required to be reported in that question. I know that there's been a lot of effort to try to better address that security clearance question, but we did look at access to mental and behavioral health services to ensure that it's accessible and that it can be obtained confidentially.
Thank you very much. Thank you, Madam Chair.
Gentleman's time has expired. Gentlewoman from California, Ms. Jacobs, is recognized for 5 minutes.
Thank you, Madam Chair, and thank you all for being here and for all of your hard work on this topic. I know it's not an easy thing to be working on day in and day out, and we really, really appreciate it. General Johnson, I wanted to follow up on some points raised earlier around the importance of prevention. In your report, a senior leader is quoted saying, "Right now, it is easier to hold the commander accountable for an incident than the environment before the incident." And I think all of us here today are grateful that we're finally moving forward on ways to hold people accountable when there is an incident. But what more can we do to make sure that the commanding officers who permit such an environment of impunity to exist in the first place are also being disciplined? In your earlier answer, you stated that too many COs lack the competencies to create an environment in which sexual harassment and assault are simply not tolerated. And I guess I'm just wondering how that's possible given the very, very many years this committee has focused on this problem.
Thank you very much for that question, Congresswoman. I would say that our focus was all primary prevention. So everything we looked at was before the event. So accountability, any of that separate. But when we looked at before the event, it was very clear to us that leaders really require these competencies that are based on an understanding of public health, behavioral health, social sciences, sociology, that doesn't exist today. And so our recommendation was that the department determine what are those, define those specific competencies, and you would have to look at the social ecological model in the report that was designed with the DoD in mind, right? So depending on where you are in that model as a leader, whether you're a frontline leader or, again, the most senior leaders in the services or in the department, you would recognize that you have a role in that model. And then it would be a matter of how do you develop those competencies? And then, so once the department designs the model, the services would then develop those competencies in the individuals and at every level. Then this is the key. It has to be evaluated. This is your point. It has to be evaluated. Some of this crosses over into what the culture and climate has looked at in terms of ensuring that you have processes for evaluating and selecting the right leaders. That ties into this, but you would actually have leaders talking to their subordinate leaders about prevention in a more meaningful way than exists today. Is it?
Thank you. And it's my understanding that on these panels, there are actually very few women. We're now at the full accountability, not the prevention piece. And in part because they're systematically removed from juries for cause as part of the voir dire process. I was just wondering, Ms. Rosenthal, did you analyze the fairness and representativeness of the jury selection process? What conclusions did you reach? If it was not part of the review, why not? And do you agree that systemic removal of women and victims advocates would be deemed unacceptable, perhaps even unconstitutional in civilian courts?
We did look at the jury pool issue, and I want to turn to Megan to address that question.
Yes, so we did look at that issue with respect to the jury pool, and that was why one of our recommendations is that especially sentencing should be taken out of the hands of military panels and placed squarely in the hands of military judges and judges alone. We didn't do an in-depth dive on the voir dire process and the how or why women might be eliminated. Of course, counsel could always issue a challenge as to why opposing counsel struck a woman from the court-martial panel, but we did not go into the in-depth details court-martial by court-martial, and quite frankly, I would be surprised if data even exists in the armed forces analyzing jury selection. I think it would be fascinating. I think that it's an area that's really ripe for some discovery of what's going on with respect to the selection of panel members, but it's just not something that we were able to do a deep analysis of.
Okay, well, maybe, Madam Chair, that's something we can ask DOD about. I will yield back now.
I thank the gentlelady. We had recommended randomizing the jury selection. Did you not recommend that in your IRC recommendations?
Yes, ma'am. We also heard from the services that randomized selection is going through a pilot program currently. So the IRC liked that idea, which is why our recommendation to keep the logistical process of convening a court-martial with the command, because we felt confident that with the randomized selection of juries and with counsel's voir dire process, we would be able to overcome the perception that commanders are handpicking the juries that they want to be able to achieve a particular result. The IRC was persuaded by the services who told us that the commander is in the best position to make, again, very logistical decisions about availability. So, for example, is this particular service member on maternity leave or paternity leave? Is this member within my charge on deployment? So we felt compelled and persuaded by this argument that the logistical mechanism of convening the court-martial was best kept with the commander, because it was just that, a purely logistical function. We felt very secure in the fact that the use of randomized selection for juries is a step in the right direction, coupled with individual counsel voir dire process, were protections enough to make sure that commanders weren't, quote, stacking the juries, unquote, to achieve a particular result.
Thank you. Mr. Brown from Maryland is recognized for 5 minutes.
Thank you, Madam Chair, and again, thank you to you and the committee for allowing me to wave on to the committee. To the panelists and the members of the IRC, I'm truly grateful for your work, like the cavalry, just in time, so I really, really appreciate your work. So as I asked earlier with Dr. Hicks, and others have identified some areas where the DOD is not accepting some of the recommendations. The one that seems to trouble me the most has to do with the special victim categories, and the IRC. You had 3 categories. One was offenses. The second was the trait of victims, and number 3 was the intent of the offender. It's my understanding that the department is willing to accept Category 1 and only Category 1. Is that accurate?
Yes, that's our understanding, sir.
So, I mean, this is the scenario that would bother me, and maybe tell me if it bothers you or not. I mean, if you have an intimate partner who chooses to embezzle their partner, to otherwise commit some form of theft against their partner, would that be covered by Category 1?
So it wouldn't be covered by Category 1 per se, because embezzlement is not an inherently special victim crime, but the crime as you described it would be covered under the IRC recommended construct because of the interpersonal nature and relationship that you just spoke of.
So that's only if you accept Category 2, though?
Yes, sir.
Right. So that's my concern. I mean, you've got what I think is very comprehensive, thoughtful approach, best practice, evidence-based, special victims units created like we have in U.S. Attorney's Office and State's Attorney's Office. The department is coming in and saying, yes, 60-day, 90-day, excellent work we're adopting, but not everything. So I think there's some real concerns here, and that what ends up happening is you have this pink court. And if it's cases that look purely sexual in nature, great, you'll get the special, independent trial counsel making decisions about referral to court-martial, but everything else, it stays with the commander. That's my fundamental concern.
Yeah, you're not wrong. The IRC believes strongly in the fact that this case, as you described it in your hypothetical, would be a special victims case.
And they're real, because it happens all the time.
Absolutely.
So, Ms. Rosenthal, the commission found that due to the breadth and depth of the lack of trust by junior enlisted service members in commanders, it was determined that the status quo or any variation of the status quo that retained commanders as disposition authorities in sexual harassment, sexual assault, and related cases would fail to offer the change required to restore confidence in the system. As I am hearing testimony, as I've heard from the department, as I read the report, I mean, trust is huge here. That seems to be, and correct me if I'm wrong, not the only, but perhaps one of the most motivating factors in what is this, a significant reform of court-martial referrals, trust, the lack of. I mean, is that accurate, or, I mean?
That's correct. That's our top finding, and it's part of this chasm between what senior leaders say about the problem, there's no tolerance for sexual assault and harassment, and what junior enlisted members experience, which is 100% tolerance in some cases. That chasm is what creates the lack of trust. The lack of trust is our key finding. It doesn't only apply to the accountability line of effort, however. It applies to having a victim advocacy workforce that is qualified to meet the needs of victims. It applies to how victims are handled and treated across the board. What we see, this reluctance to report, has to do when someone who's experienced sexual assault sees how their peer is handled when they too experience sexual assault, and they see the bullying and the ostracism, that commanders are not stepping in and taking charge of
And let me
all
just,
of that.
and I appreciate that. Let me just jump in. I think that lack of trust, I know it wasn't in the scope. I think that lack of trust spills over in a huge way when it comes to race and ethnicity, under prosecution for sexual assaults, over prosecution, Black and brown service members. Ms. Tokash, in your personal opinion, do you think that removing all felony offenses or treating them the same way that the commission recommends we treat sexual assault cases, do you think that would make sense?
So, to be clear, I came onto this commission, and I had to, from a place of neutrality. Obviously, I had former military service as a special victim prosecutor in the Army, and I'm a current assistant United States attorney, so a career prosecutor by trade. I had to come to this commission from a place of neutrality because the task required nothing less. Our charter was very, very narrowly focused. If we had another 90 days, we could maybe examine whether all felonies, if there's even a problem that exists with that, with all felonies uttering false checks, larceny, homicide. That was just not in our charter. And what we were focused on were sexual harassment and sexual assault. And so as we focused on that, that is how we landed on this lack of trust in the system. And again, I think to your initial point, Congressman Brown, is that it's because these crimes are so interpersonal in nature. It's what makes them so complex and requires independent, highly trained special victim prosecutors, because these crimes are unique, they're different. They're not uttering a false check. They're not a homicide with no other motives. They're not a larceny, a barracks larceny. These are crimes that are so interpersonal in nature. They demand and they should have the specialization of special victim prosecutors and other specialized trained investigators and victim advocates to be able to champion these cases through the military justice system.
Gentleman's time is expired.
Thank you, Madam Chair.
Let me just follow up with that briefly, Ms. Tokash. In the case of the tragic death of Vanessa Guillen, under the DOD proposal, that case would not come under the aegis of the Special Victims Unit, correct?
Correct. It would come under the special victim prosecutor construct that the IRC has recommended. And the IRC would have taken Ms. Guillen's case. And we would have taken it because during the course of the homicide investigation, when investigators learned that Ms. Guillen was previously sexually harassed, that trained military criminal investigator would have contacted the special victim prosecutor, who then would have moved to action and addressed the sexual harassment case. But what we know from fiscal year 2019 data and the Fort Hood report as it pertained to Army CID, 92% of the criminal investigators at Fort Hood, Texas, during the Vanessa Guillen investigation were not even properly credentialed.
They were apprentices, weren't they?
They were, and so that phone call was never made. And that is a tragedy. That is why this commission feels so deeply about the three categories that define the special victim construct. And so, we are here to say that we would have taken your family's case. Absolutely.
The other issue that is plaguing me as well is child abuse. Under what the Department of Defense has recommended, child abuse would not come under the special victims review. Therefore, the child would be subject to, I think, undue challenges in terms of testifying and the like as well. What are your thoughts on that?
There may be no more special victim that greater than a child for a whole host of reasons. And that is also why the IRC included children and also the elderly in our special victims construct.
All right. I think we've covered everything. Mr. Gallagher, do you have any final questions or comments?
I do not, but I just want to thank our witnesses for not only being here today, but just for all the work and energy they put into this report. This was a very fruitful discussion. Thank you.
Thank you, Congressman. I just want to say on behalf of all of us how deeply grateful we are for your professionalism, for the deep understanding that you had prior to or as a result of your work that brought a product to this committee that is worthy of our not just review but implementation on every level. I really believe that. And I look forward to more opportunities to engage with all of you. And I want to thank you again on behalf of the American people and the Congress of the United States. We stand adjourned.
Thank you.